They say some places are born from the sea and some from the sky, but there is one place that belongs to neither. An island no map can hold, no compass can find, and no memory can keep the same. Sailors have sworn it shifts with the tides, slipping between centuries like a shadow in the fog. Kingdoms have risen on its shores and vanished without a whisper. Those who return speak in fragments, their eyes haunted, as if they left something behind they can never name. Tonight, you will step onto its sand for yourself. And once you do, the world you knew will never be the same. Some islands vanish because the sea swallows them. This one moves. It was the year 1789, a winter night thick with fog that rolled in from the Atlantic like the breath of something ancient and unseen. In the upper room of a cramped office off the docks of Portsmouth, Edward Lawrence, a man the Admiralty trusted more than they trusted their own captains, bent over a long oak desk. His tools were the finest: brass dividers, a quill sharpened to a hair's point, and a compass that had once belonged to his father, who had charted the coastline of Africa before being lost at sea. Lawrence was no dreamer. He believed in ink and measurement, in the cold certainty of degrees and minutes, in the unbending lines of latitude and longitude. He had mapped islands born of volcanic fury, coastlines chewed ragged by centuries of waves, shoals that could rip the hull out from beneath a man before he could draw a single breath. But what he found that night was none of those. The parchment before him was a composite, stitched together from months of reports, sketches, and journals sent by captains of His Majesty's Navy. Somewhere between Madeira and the Azores, far from any busy shipping lane, a speck of land appeared on 3 separate charts. Each claimed it had been sighted on a different day by a different ship. Lawrence leaned closer, candlelight pooling in the inked outlines of the small shape. It was no larger than the head of a pin on his map, yet its coordinates, they didn't match. One report placed it east by 50 nautical miles. Another, west by nearly the same. The third was so far adrift it could not possibly be the same island. And yet, in every drawing, it was identical. A crescent-shaped strip of land with a jagged spine of hills down its center, a narrow inlet, and a stand of palms clustered like sentinels on the southern shore. He sat back, frowning. A slip of the hand? Lawrence had seen enough sloppy navigation to know these men were skilled, and they were not the sort to invent geography. He should have discarded the notion then, dismissed it as an error, perhaps the phantom shadow of a low-lying cloud. But the image clung to him. He pulled from the shelf an old leather-bound volume, his father's logbook. Page after page was filled with careful script, the ink faded but legible. Near the middle, in an entry dated June 14, 1754, he found it, cited an isle not present on prior charts. Shape curved like the bow of a hunter. Approach impossible due to shifting currents. Coordinates as follows. Lawrence's eyes traced the numbers. They were impossibly close to one of the modern reports, yet 35 years apart. He felt a chill that was not from the draft at the window. By the following week, Lawrence had written to the Admiralty for access to their sealed archives, the kind that required signatures from men in wigs and coats of state. The response took days, but when it came, a courier placed into his hand a heavy box of records bound in oilskin. Inside was a history of sightings that stretched back centuries. A Venetian merchant captain in 1623 had sworn to seeing a green shore rise out of a morning mist, only for it to vanish before midday. A Portuguese explorer in 1519 wrote of finding fresh water in a spring beneath strange trees, the air filled with a scent like burning sugar, then waking the next morning to find only endless sea in every direction. But it was not just sailors. There were letters from missionaries who claimed the island had people on it, tall, pale figures who spoke no language they recognized, whose clothes were woven of some silvery fabric that glittered like fish scales. There was a report, unsigned and undated, that spoke of ships lured toward its shores by strange lights, only to wreck themselves on unseen reefs. Survivors, it said, sometimes washed ashore, only to disappear within days. And the most unsettling thing of all, each record placed the island somewhere different. The Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, the waters off Greenland. Always the same crescent shape, always the same inlet. Lawrence began to dream of it. The dreams were not violent. but they left him uneasy. The sound of waves breaking against a shore he had never stood upon, the smell of fruit ripening in heavy air, and a feeling, sharp, urgent, that if he did not set foot there soon, something would be lost to him forever. One evening, in the low light of his study, Lawrence received a visitor. The man was a sailor, broad-shouldered but hollow-eyed, his skin weathered to the color of walnut. He gave no name, only said he had heard Lawrence was looking for a certain piece of land. From his coat, the man produced a folded scrap of parchment. When Lawrence opened it, he found a sketch of the island, perfect in every detail, and beneath it, a set of coordinates. "Where did you get this?" Lawrence asked. The man smiled without warmth. "From a ship that should have been 3 weeks dead." He would say no more. Lawrence marked the coordinates on his master chart. They lay in the mid-Atlantic, days away even in the fastest clipper. He checked them again before sleeping, leaving the chart spread across his desk. When dawn came, he returned to find the ink still fresh, but the coordinates had shifted nearly 200 miles west. For a moment he simply stared. Then, heart pounding, he began to cross-reference every set of coordinates in his possession. The pattern was maddening. No two matched exactly, but taken together, they traced a path that defied reason, as if the island were being moved across the oceans by some unseen hand. The Royal Navy's Master Register, which he was now permitted to consult, confirmed his growing fear. There were dozens of official sightings spanning centuries, all from credible captains, all placed in different oceans. And yet each depiction was the same down to the curve of the bay. The island was moving. The more Lawrence studied, the less he slept. Food lost its taste. The faces of friends and neighbors blurred into shadows. His every waking thought was of the island, not of the mystery itself, but of the pull it seemed to exert upon him. It was as though it wanted to be found, but only by him. On the night of March 3rd, a storm pounded the coast, the wind rattling the shutters like a madman trying to claw his way in. Lawrence sat at his desk, the candle nearly burned down to a stub, the map before him. Rain streaked the window. Somewhere in the darkness, a bell tolled, the harbor's warning that the tide was turning. He dipped his pen and began to write in his journal, the words flowing as though his hand were guided by another. "If I sail at dawn, I can catch it before it moves again." He signed his name, blotted the ink, and closed the book. When the sun rose, the dockhands saw him loading a small sloop with provisions. He spoke to no one. By mid-morning, he was gone, a dark silhouette against the horizon. The ship was later found adrift off the coast of Madeira, sails torn, provisions untouched. There was no sign of Lawrence. No logbook, no map, only a single scrap of parchment nailed to the mast, bearing the outline of a crescent-shaped island. Some say the currents took him. Others whisper that he found the island and it kept him. And though more than 2 centuries have passed, sailors still report glimpses of a green shore where no island should be. The Admiralty no longer marks it on their charts, but in the sealed records of the Royal Navy, under a heading written in Lawrence's own hand, there is a single word, moving. And in the margin, in ink faded to brown, someone has added, "Wait for it to come to you." Dr. Eleanor Voss had always trusted maps more than people. They didn't lie, didn't flatter, didn't twist their stories in the way human mouths did. A map was an oath etched in ink, the lines of rivers, the bone-white curve of a coastline, the silent geometry of latitude and longitude. But on an overcast afternoon in late October, she found herself staring at a map that did nothing but contradict itself. The logs had arrived in a battered wooden crate from the Maritime Archives in Greenwich, smelling faintly of dust and salt. They were bound in cracked leather, the pages spotted with the fingerprints of long-dead navigators. Eleanor, whose work as a geographer often meant weeks of scanning records for patterns no one else cared to see, had been sifting through documents on shipwreck clusters when she noticed it. An island, always the same crescent shape, always described in terms so consistent they might have been copied. The inlet to the south, the ridge of dark hills along its spine, the peculiar paleness of its sand. And always the coordinates that didn't agree. She drew them onto her own master chart. One in the Coral Sea, another in the Norwegian Sea. a third in the Drake Passage, where the wind could shear a mast clean in two. At first, she thought it must be a clerical fluke. Perhaps the name of the island had traveled, been attached to different bits of land. But then she overlaid the locations with her real project, a database of the year's worst shipwrecks. The match was perfect. Every single coordinate, every one, spread across centuries, lay within a day's sail of a wreck site. Some were merchant ships, others fishing trawlers, others still modern luxury yachts swallowed by storms that weather satellites swore had never existed. As if the island itself had pulled them toward it, like a lighthouse whose beam was made of temptation instead of warning. She felt a knot tighten low in her stomach. She had seen strange things in her career, phantom lakes that appeared after earthquakes and drained within days, forests of petrified trees standing like a congregation frozen mid-prayer, but nothing like this. This was no geological anomaly. It was something else. Something that played with position and time as if they were strands of thread. Her phone buzzed. It was Victor, a data analyst she'd worked with before. "You'll want to see this," he said when she answered. "I ran those coordinates you sent me through the satellite archives." Within the hour, she was in his cramped office, staring at the grainy images rotating on his monitor. The first was from 3 months ago, taken by a weather satellite scanning the South Pacific. A small, distinct landmass, its crescent shape clear even through the low resolution. The next image, just 2 weeks later, showed only open ocean. "Storm surge," she suggested weakly. "Maybe," Victor said. But then, he clicked and another image appeared. Same crescent island, same inlet. But this was from the North Atlantic, over 6,000 miles away, captured barely a month after the Pacific image. Eleanor felt her throat go dry. She leaned closer, searching for any telltale sign it was an artifact, a shadow, a reflection, a fragment of cloud. But the light, the texture, the pattern of vegetation all argued against that. This was the same island, the exact same island. It was impossible, and yet there it was. She left Victor's office with a copy of the images and the faint scent of burnt coffee in her hair. All the way back to her flat, the wind off the Thames felt sharper than it should, as if it carried news she hadn't yet heard. She barely noticed when the street lamps flickered in the mist. That night, she dreamed of water. Not drowning, not adrift, but standing waist-deep in a bay that shimmered like molten silver. Far out on the horizon, an island shifted, not with the tide, but of its own accord, sliding across the surface of the sea like a piece on some vast, invisible board. The next morning, she rose early and returned to the logs. Her mind was no longer searching for explanations. It was searching for witnesses. She found them in the margins. Sailors who claimed to have seen the island where no land should be, officers who swore their compasses spun the moment they approached, navigators who marked their sightings but never again trusted the sea. And then there were the survivors. One entry, dated 1927, came from a lifeboat crew rescued near Iceland. They had been bound for New York when their ship struck something massive under the surface. It was an island, the survivor insisted, but it wasn't there the day before. We would have seen it. We were looking right at it. Eleanor began pinning photographs and maps to the wall of her study until it looked like the nerve center of an unsolved crime. The lines she drew between the coordinates made no sense on a conventional map. They looped and crossed in defiance of ocean currents, as if obeying rules no human navigator understood. The more she traced them, the more she felt a pull in her chest, like the echo of a rope being drawn tight. She thought of Edward Lorenz, the 18th century mapmaker whose name kept surfacing in the oldest reports. He had written that he would catch it before it moves again. He had sailed at dawn and never returned. It was late when Victor called again. "I've got another image. Fresh this time. Yesterday's pass." The connection fuzzed, but she caught the urgency in his voice. He sent the file, and she opened it immediately. The resolution was terrible, heavy cloud cover, the kind that smothers detail, but through the murk, she could just make out the curve of the crescent. And something else. Near the inlet, where the beach widened into a pale crescent of sand, a shape stood alone. Not a rock, too straight, too narrow. Not a tree, too isolated. It was a figure. She zoomed in until the pixels bled into each other. Still, the shape resolved into something human, arms slightly raised, the faint suggestion of movement, waving. The logical part of her mind fought to dismiss it. Could be a distortion, a play of light. But the longer she looked, the harder it was to see it as anything but a person. And in that moment, the quiet, rational world she'd always trusted, the world of maps and measurement, shifted under her feet. Because if someone was waving, they were alive. And if they were alive, they were waiting for someone to see them. She printed the image and pinned it to the center of her wall over every other map and photograph. Then she stepped back, staring at the web of lines and dates radiating out from it like spokes from a wheel. It was no longer just a mystery of geography. It was an invitation, or perhaps a warning. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of salt water, though the nearest open sea was miles away. And Eleanor, standing alone in her dimly lit study, felt something she had never felt in all her years of work. Not wonder, not fear, but the strange, intoxicating certainty that the island was aware of her, and that it had just made its first move. Eleanor had never been one to chase ghosts. She dealt in archives, data points, fixed coordinates. But the island's image, and that lone figure waving from the shoreline, had pulled her into a current she could no longer resist. Satellite images could only tell her so much. If she wanted answers, she would have to speak to the few who had claimed to set foot on that shifting strip of land and live to tell the tale. There were not many. The maritime disaster registries were thick with names of ships lost in calm seas, their positions eerily near where the island had last been sighted. But among them, she found rare anomalies, vessels that had gone missing and then reappeared days, sometimes weeks later, their hulls battered but afloat, with a handful of survivors clinging to life. Those names she marked. And then she began the long process of finding them. It took weeks. Many were long dead. Others had vanished again, their lives swallowed not by the sea but by some invisible undertow that kept them from ever returning to the world. Of the handful who still lived, most refused to talk once they learned what she was asking. A man in Halifax slammed the door in her face. A woman in Lisbon simply turned pale and whispered, "It's not finished with me," before disappearing into the back room of her apartment and never coming out again. But persistence has its own gravity, and eventually, one by one, they began to speak. The first was an aging deckhand named Miguel who had survived the wreck of the fishing trawler Santa Rosalia off the coast of Chile. His hands trembled as he described the island. It was like a dream at first. "We thought we'd been saved. There was food, bananas, coconuts, fish so fat they almost leapt into our nets. The water was sweet. The air was warm. But at night," he trailed off, eyes clouding. Eleanor leaned forward. "What happened at night?" "They talked," he whispered. "Not in words we understood, but close, like they were trying to speak through the sound of the waves. The trees, the rocks, the wind. It wasn't just noise, it was language. And the shoreline, it moved. We would wake, and the beach would be narrower or wider. The inlet would curve differently. It was as if the island was breathing." Another survivor, a Norwegian named Anya, had been part of a yacht crew that went missing in the Caribbean. "You don't understand," she told Eleanor in a voice that shook between defiance and dread. "It's beautiful, yes, the kind of beauty that makes you forget your own name. But it's not for you. You walk in the forest, and the path you took is gone. You follow the sound of water, and it leads you back to the same clearing over and over. We built a fire, and in the morning, the fire pit was gone. Like we had never been there." "Did you see anyone else?" Eleanor asked. Anya hesitated. "Shadows. Felt watching. But when you looked, they were only trees." The stories bled into one another. Different voices, same details. The first sight was always salvation. The days felt timeless, full of easy living. The nights brought the whispers, the shifting ground, and the sense of being observed. Some spoke of seeing lights under the water, as if the island was rooted in a city of phosphorescent ruins. Others swore they had glimpsed faces in the waves, pale and expressionless, sinking back into the depths. But one survivor was different. His name was Thomas Reed, and he had been found adrift in a lifeboat off Cape Verde in 1986, his vessel presumed lost in a storm. Now, nearly 4 decades later, he lived alone in a crumbling cottage on the Cornish coast. When Eleanor knocked, he answered slowly, the door groaning open to reveal a man whose eyes were pale, clouded, and unseeing. "You're here about the island," he said before she could introduce herself. His voice was low, as though the words were not meant for the open air. She told him who she was, and that she'd spoken to others. "They told you the surface of it," he said, "not the truth." He gestured for her to sit. Inside, the house smelled faintly of seawater, though they were half a mile from the shore. "What truth?" she asked. Reed folded his hands. "The island chooses who can leave." The words sank into the room like stones into deep water. Eleanor felt a prickle run up her arms. "When we landed," Reed continued, "it was perfect. I was young then, so I thought I'd found paradise. But every night, the whispers came. Not outside, inside. In my head. They spoke in a language I didn't know, yet I understood it. They asked questions I couldn't answer. Or maybe I didn't want to. I watched the others change. They began to wander off into the trees and not return. By the end, it was just me and a woman named Claire. One morning, she was gone too. That was when it came for me." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked quietly. "I woke up on the lifeboat. Alone. No memory of getting into it. Just the endless ocean and the feeling that something was still watching from behind me." He turned his blind gaze toward her. "When I opened my eyes days later, in a hospital, I couldn't see. The doctors blamed the sun, the glare on the water. They were wrong. The island took my sight so I couldn't find my way back. Or maybe so I wouldn't look for it." Eleanor's mind churned with his words. The idea that the island could decide, that it could select survivors, fit too well with the erratic history of sightings and disappearances. She thought of the figure in the satellite image, standing on that pale shore. Waiting. Perhaps waving for help. Or perhaps bidding her to stay away. Reed reached into a drawer and pulled something out. It was an old compass, its brass casing worn to a dull gold, the glass scratched. "I had this with me," he said. "It still works, but not like it should." She took it from him and held it in her palm. The needle quivered, then began to spin in lazy, unpredictable circles. "When I'm near the sea," Reed said, "it stops spinning. Points straight toward it. Doesn't matter where I am, always toward the sea. I think it's pointing at them." Eleanor looked up from the compass, and for the first time in her career, she could not tell if she was holding an instrument or an omen. Outside, the wind shifted. Through the thin walls of the cottage, she could hear the distant boom of waves against rock. The needle stilled and pointed not to the window, not to the landward horizon, but directly behind her, toward the ocean. The compass had not stopped pointing to the sea since the day Thomas Reed placed it in Eleanor's hand. In the weeks that followed, it became less an artifact and more a tether, something she could feel pulling at her even when it lay hidden in a desk drawer. It was not a tool to be studied at arm's length. It was a demand. The decision to join an expedition was not made lightly. Eleanor knew better than most what the ocean could take from those who underestimated it. But she also knew that every map she had ever drawn, every chart she had studied, had been leading here. The stories of Miguel, Anya, Reed, and the others were not loose ends. They were coordinates of a different kind, and now they pointed toward action. She did not go to the Admiralty, nor to any academic body that might have delayed her with committees and funding proposals. Instead, she found the Archimedes, an aging but well-kept private research vessel moored in Bergen. Its captain, Daniel Rourke, was a man whose eyes suggested he had seen the ocean in moods most people could not imagine. He did not flinch when Eleanor explained what they were chasing. "You'll get no charts for this course," he said. "We'll be sailing blind." "I'm bringing my own chart," she replied, and placed the spinning compass between them. The Archimedes left port on a slate-gray morning, the sea cold and restless. Her crew was a mix of scientists, sailors, and those who simply could not resist the lure of a mystery at sea. They carried sonar, deep-sea drones, and satellite comms, but none of it mattered to Eleanor as much as the small brass weight in her pocket. From the first day, the compass took command. It pointed them northeast, away from any established shipping lane. The GPS protested almost immediately, declaring that they were moving in circles. The instruments suggested they had passed the same coordinates 3 times in as many days, but when Eleanor stood at the bow and let the wind cut across her face, she felt, without being able to prove, that they were moving forward. Rourke was skeptical but did not argue. "Sometimes," he said, "the sea plays by rules you can't chart." On the 4th day, the weather turned. The sky sank lower, the horizon narrowing into a cold steel line. The GPS began to blink warnings of signal instability, and the sonar readings came back with shadows that made no sense, landmasses where there should be none, then nothing at all. Eleanor spent her nights in the cabin, cross-referencing their supposed position with historical sightings. What she saw unnerved her. Their looping course was threading through points where the island had been seen before, in 1789, in 1927, in 1986. It was as though they were not chasing it so much as following in its wake, step for step across centuries. On the 7th night, the fog came. It rolled in without warning, as sudden as a door closing. One moment the horizon was visible in all directions, the next it was swallowed in a white so dense it seemed solid. The sound of the sea changed too, softer, muffled, as though they had sailed into a room with walls. The crew moved slowly now, voices low, footsteps careful. Eleanor stayed on deck, the compass in her hand. For the first time, its needle did not spin. It pointed unerringly into the fog ahead. Then, out of the pale nothing, shapes began to emerge. At first they seemed like mirages, smudges of darker gray against the white. But as they drew closer, the shapes resolved into the jagged crowns of trees, palm trees, impossibly tall, their fronds swaying in wind that did not touch the Archimedes. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. Palm trees here in the North Sea, where no palm had ever grown. The fog thinned just enough for her to see the curve of a shoreline. The same pale sand from the satellite images. The same crescent bay that had haunted the accounts of every survivor she'd met. It was the island. A ripple of awe and unease passed through the crew. Some muttered prayers. Others gripped the railings, their eyes wide as if afraid to blink. Eleanor could not speak. The compass in her hand felt warm, almost alive. "Ready the launch," Rourke called, but his voice was softer than usual, as though he feared to disturb whatever force had placed this thing in their path. They were still a quarter mile from shore when it happened. The water beneath them shifted, not in waves, but in something deeper, stranger, a slow, rolling movement, as if the sea itself had turned in its sleep. The shoreline, so close a moment before, began to slide sideways. At first, Eleanor thought it was the fog playing tricks, but no, the palm trees were moving with it, the entire island gliding away without disturbing the water around it. It was like watching a continent unmoor itself, the land moving not because of currents, but because it willed itself to. "Engines ahead!" Rourke barked, but even as the Archimedes surged forward, the island receded, as though slipping behind some invisible curtain. The compass needle trembled in Eleanor's palm, spinning once before jerking back toward the vanishing shore. She gripped the railing, her breath clouding in the cold air, and knew with absolute certainty that the island had seen them. And it had decided, for reasons beyond her grasp, to keep its distance. The fog thickened again, swallowing the last trace of palm fronds, and the sea returned to its ordinary motion. But Eleanor's pulse told her the truth. Nothing about what they had just seen was ordinary. They had not lost the island. The island had slipped away. The island did not return immediately. For 2 more days, the Archimedes drifted in waters where the fog seemed too heavy for the wind that moved across it, where the sea's color shifted from steel to emerald to ink black without warning. The crew grew restless. Eleanor could feel it too, the mounting pressure of anticipation, the quiet suspicion that the island might never show itself again. But on the 3rd morning, the fog broke. It didn't thin gradually as fog normally does. It tore apart, ripped open in ragged seams, and through those gaps came the glint of sunlight on pale sand. The island lay ahead, crescent-shaped, with a ridge of hills like the bent spine of some ancient sea creature. Palm fronds shivered in the distance, their green vivid against the silver blue of the water. Rourke didn't have to order the launch. The crew was already lowering it. Eleanor climbed in, clutching the compass, its needle locked and still now, pointing directly at the beach. The row was strangely silent. Even the water seemed hushed, the oars slicing through it without the usual slap and splash. When they stepped ashore, it was like walking into a dream someone else had made. The sand was soft and fine, warm underfoot despite the northern latitude. Just beyond the beach, a stream trickled down from the ridge, its water so clear it seemed invisible until it pooled in the dips between stones. Fruit hung heavy in the trees, papayas, bananas, coconuts, all ripe, all perfect. There was no rot, no insect buzz, no bird call. Only the sound of the stream and the distant sigh of the tide. The first footprints they made were deep, well-defined. Eleanor's boots left crisp edges in the sand as she followed the stream inland. But when she turned back, the marks were already softening, as though a slow tide of invisible hands was brushing them away. By the time she reached the treeline, the trail had vanished entirely. Others noticed it too. "Like it's swallowing us," one sailor murmured. Another laughed too loudly, saying it was just wind or shifting grains. But there was no wind. They set camp just beyond the stream, on a flat stretch shaded by the palms. As the crew unloaded gear, Eleanor wandered toward the ridge. The slope was steeper than it appeared, and the soil beneath the thin carpet of grass was a strange reddish-brown, rich with the scent of iron. Halfway up, her foot caught on something hard. She brushed the soil away and saw stone, not the rough, fractured kind that breaks naturally, but a carved surface. She knelt, sweeping more of the earth aside. A tablet emerged, broad and flat, its edges worn by time but its carvings still sharp. It was covered in symbols, curling lines, starbursts, wave-like shapes that looped into one another. No script she knew, and she had studied enough ancient languages to recognize at least a root or two. Here, there was nothing familiar, but the meaning was clear enough in the imagery. A chain of islands, each distinct in shape, each placed at different points on what looked like an ocean map. Arrows connected them, curling and bending in strange trajectories. It looked like a game board, or a battlefield. The islands seemed to be moving like chess pieces. She called for Rourke, who studied the tablet with narrowed eyes. "Could be a map," he said. "Of where?" He didn't answer. By evening, camp was settled. Fires were lit, though the wood gathered on the island burned with a curious, almost blue flame. The fruit was sweet, almost too sweet, the water from the stream crisp and cold. For a while, the crew relaxed. Jokes were told. Boots came off. Someone found a patch of smooth sand and began sketching ships in it with a stick. Night came without warning. There was no sunset, just the sudden dimming of light, as though a hand had been placed over the sky. The firelight seemed to pool without spilling far into the surrounding darkness. Eleanor tried to sleep, but the ground felt subtly different beneath her, as if the very shape of the land was breathing. Somewhere in the early hours, she woke. No sound had disturbed her, just a feeling, the same one she'd had on the Archimedes when she knew the island was near. She unzipped the tent and stepped into the darkness. The shoreline was not where it had been. The stream that had run beside their camp now bent at a sharper angle, cutting into the beach before curling back toward the ridge. The crescent of the bay was narrower, its arc tighter. The palm trees that had stood in a neat cluster were scattered now, their positions subtly but unmistakably altered. Her gaze shifted to the camp, and her chest went cold. Half the tents were gone. Not collapsed. Not taken down. Gone. The sand where they had been pitched was smooth, unbroken, as though nothing had ever stood there. The fires were still burning in the remaining pits, but the people who had slept in those vanished tents were nowhere to be seen. Eleanor's breath caught. In the distance, near the new curve of the bay, she thought she saw movement, tall shapes, just at the edge of vision. They did not move like men. They did not move like anything she knew. The wind, which had been absent all day, stirred at last. It carried with it a faint sound, low and layered, like many voices speaking at once in a language she could not understand. She felt the pull of the compass even without touching it, as if it were somewhere deep in her chest. The island was changing, shifting under her feet, and she understood then that they were no longer simply visitors. They were pieces on its board, and the game had just begun. Eleanor did not remember falling asleep, only the cold that woke her. It crept into her bones as though she had been left out in the open all night. For a moment she thought it was the aftertaste of fear, the memory of half the camp vanishing into nothing. But when she pushed open the tent flap, the truth made her breath catch. The palms were white, not pale with moonlight, not dusted with sand, but white with frost. Thin sheets of ice traced every frond, glittering faintly in the gray dawn. The air was sharp, dry, and tasted of winter. She could see her breath fog as she stepped outside, the fine crunch of frozen sand beneath her boots replacing yesterday's soft, warm give. Around her, the crew emerged slowly, shivering in coats and blankets. The stream beside camp had skinned over with ice, its flow reduced to a muffled gurgle beneath a frozen shell. The fruit trees that had been heavy with papayas now sagged under frost, their fruits solid as stone. "This isn't possible," Rourke muttered, running a gloved hand along the icy bark of a coconut tree. "We were in temperate waters. No frost. No cold snap. Not here." The GPS unit, which had stubbornly given their position the day before, now flickered uncertainly, its coordinates shifting every few seconds. Eleanor didn't need the numbers to tell her what was wrong. The light in the sky was different. The sun was too low, the angle all wrong for their supposed latitude. When night returned, she confirmed it. She had grown up under the stars, taught by her father to navigate by constellations. Even in her years of research, the sky had been a constant companion, the same dependable map above every ocean. But here, now, when darkness fell, the constellations were wrong. Entirely wrong. Not shifted slightly as they might be if they had sailed hundreds of miles, but wholly unfamiliar. The Southern Cross glittered sharp and bright overhead, though they had never sailed south. Orion's belt was absent. They were under a different hemisphere's sky. The crew murmured about magnetic anomalies, about optical illusions caused by weather. But Eleanor could see it in their eyes, the same unease that had been building since the moment they stepped ashore. The island wasn't just moving through space. It was moving through somewhere else. Morning of the second day brought its own proof. They were inventorying supplies when McKenna, one of the younger crewmen, wandered off toward the tree lean to relieve himself. He was gone less than a minute before they heard his shout. When he stumbled back into camp, he was drenched to the skin, water streaming from his hair and clothes. The smell of salt water rolled off him, unmistakable even in the cold air. "You fell in the stream?" Rourke asked, incredulous. McKenna shook his head violently. No, I walked between two palms, and suddenly I was standing on a rocky shore. Black cliffs, big waves, and a lighthouse. An old one. Brick tower, whitewashed, with the light turning slow, like it was hand-cranked. Then the spray hit me and I was back here. He gestured at the frost-covered trees. "Just here." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Could you hear anything?" "A bell," he said after a pause. "Not like a church bell. A buoy bell." But the tone was wrong, like it was ringing underwater. The words settled into Eleanor's thoughts with the weight of recognition. Reed's stories, Miguel's dreams, the whispers in the night, all pieces of the same impossible puzzle. The island wasn't just shifting along the surface of the earth. It was opening into other places, other times. She returned to the stone tablet she had unearthed days earlier. By the light of the pale winter sun, the carvings seemed sharper than before. The islands on it no longer felt symbolic. They felt real, each a distinct destination in the chain. And if the arrows meant what she suspected, the island they were standing on could step between them at will. That evening, she stood alone at the edge of the beach, watching the horizon blur into mist. The frost on the palms was melting now, running in slow rivulets into the sand. The sea was still, unnaturally so, like a pane of glass. It was then she saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow, a smudge against the meeting of sea and sky. But as the light shifted, the outline grew clearer, A ridge of hills, a cluster of palms, a crescent bay. An island, identical to the one she stood on. She blinked, thinking it might be a mirage, some trick of the strange light. But the details were too perfect. The same curve of shoreline, the same rise of the central ridge, the same pale sweep of sand. It was as though the island had cast its reflection not onto water, but into the distance. And it was drawing closer. The sight of the second island haunted them through the night. It hovered just beyond the horizon like a half-remembered dream, its shape a perfect echo of the ground beneath their feet. The frost on the palms had melted by dusk, and the air had warmed again, but the unease remained, a gnawing sense that they were staring at something more than a trick of light. By morning, the twin had drawn closer. It was no longer a shadow but a mirror, the same crescent bay, the same ridge rising like a sleeping serpent, even the same scatter of palm trees leaning toward the shore. The water between them was eerily still, a glass channel that seemed to invite crossing. Rourke gave the order to launch. The smaller boat slid silently into the water, and Eleanor joined the rowers, her eyes fixed on the perfect copy ahead. The compass in her pocket quivered, the needle shifting in small, uneasy jerks, as though it did not know which island to favor. They landed on the Twin Islands beach without resistance. The sand was the same pale, fine grit they had left behind, but as Eleanor stepped ashore, she felt an odd familiarity deeper than sight or touch. She looked down and froze. Footprints. Not just the fresh ones they were making now, but older prints pressed into the sand, leading from the waterline toward the treeline. The size, the spacing, she recognized them. They were hers. A few meters away, half buried in the sand, was a coil of rope. She knew the brand. It had been aboard the Archimedes. Further inland, she found a torn scrap of canvas stamped with their expedition's insignia. The edges were frayed, weathered, but unmistakable. "We've been here before," she murmured. The crew traded uneasy looks. "Impossible," one said. "We only just saw it." Eleanor said nothing. Her mind was moving too quickly, threading this place into the pattern that had been growing since they first sighted the moving island. They pressed inward, following the trail of their own absence. The palms opened onto a clearing where the air felt heavier, as though the ground itself held its breath. And there, half hidden beneath moss and vine, stood the twin to the stone tablet Eleanor had unearthed on the first island. It was identical in design, a wide slab etched with curling lines, starbursts, and the strange wave-like marks she could not read. The same chain of islands, the same curling arrows between them. But this tablet was broken. A jagged crack ran through its center, and a piece the size of a book was missing from the lower left corner. Eleanor's hand moved to her pack almost without thought. She drew out the fragment she had found earlier, the one she had carried since the day they landed. Its shape matched the gap perfectly. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on her. The crew stood silent, eyes fixed on her hands. Then she fitted the fragment into place. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the carvings seemed to deepen, the grooves darkening as though ink had been poured into them. The symbols rearranged themselves, the lines shifting like a puzzle solved after centuries of waiting. At the center of the tablet, one island glowed faintly in the pale light. A series of marks curved away from it, looping into a cluster of numbers and symbols. Eleanor recognized some as celestial coordinates, the kind used for mapping stars, but the rest formed a date. Not in any calendar she knew, yet the conversion was simple enough to see. It was a date 600 years in the future. Her breath caught. The crew muttered behind her, the sound sharp with disbelief. 6 centuries from now, that was where, and when, the island was moving. She touched the glowing mark, and for a moment the air hummed, a low vibration that made the ground feel alive. It faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the wind rustling through the palms. Rourke broke the silence. "If this is right, then we're not just chasing it across oceans. We're chasing it across time." Before Eleanor could answer, the sky darkened. Clouds gathered in unnatural speed, roiling in from every direction until the light was swallowed whole. A wind rose from nowhere, warm and wet, smelling of storms far out to sea. The air crackled as if the world had been wound too tight. A jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, its white glare turning the sand to glass in an instant. In that momentary flash, Eleanor saw the impossible. The two islands, hers and its twin, were moving. Not drifting with the current, not tilting on their foundations, but sliding toward one another as though drawn by an unseen force. The still water between them churned to life, spirals forming that reached down into the depths. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. Another flash lit the horizon, and the islands met. The impact was not the shattering collision of rock on rock. It was stranger, softer, like two halves of a thing rejoining after a long separation. The ground shook beneath Eleanor's feet, the palm trunks swaying in slow arcs. She felt the air change, a deep pressure that pressed against her chest and filled her ears. Somewhere, far below or far away, she thought she heard voices, not the whispers of the night they had endured before, but something grander, older. A chorus, speaking in that same unknowable language, welcoming or warning, she could not tell. Then the sound was gone, swallowed by the rush of the wind. When the clouds parted at last, there was only one island where there had been two. The collision of the islands had not shattered the earth as Eleanor feared it might. Instead, it had been an almost graceful folding together, like two halves of an ancient map pressed into alignment after centuries apart. But the joining was not without consequence. The ground trembled for hours afterward, a deep, steady quiver that worked its way into bone and thought alike. The surf, which had been strangely still before, returned in force, waves pounding the new shoreline as though testing its seams. And with each retreat of the tide, the sea revealed more than it should have. Not sand, not coral, but stone. Eleanor was the first to step toward the exposed shallows. At first she thought it was simply rock smoothed by centuries of water, but as the foam slid away, shapes began to emerge, steps, worn and irregular, descending from the beach into the sea. Beyond them, half hidden by kelp and drifting sand, lay the outline of walls. Rourke joined her, his boots sinking into the wet sand. "Ruins," he said, his voice caught somewhere between awe and suspicion. But these ruins were wrong. Eleanor had walked among Mayan pyramids swallowed by jungle, seen the marble columns of Greek temples toppled by earthquakes, traced the foundations of Viking longhouses on windswept cliffs, but never all at once. Here, the stones did not belong to a single place or time. Basalt columns rose like those of the Giant's Causeway, yet were inlaid with intricate patterns like the tiled floors of ancient Damascus. Pillars of pale limestone were capped with capitals in the lotus style of Old Kingdom Egypt, but beneath them, archways had the scalloped precision of Mughal palaces. It was as though fragments from civilizations that had never known each other had been plucked from their rightful homes and set together here, piece by impossible piece. The tide fell lower, and the sea gave up more of its secrets. Streets, if they could be called that, wound between the structures, their paving stones carved with sigils Eleanor had never seen before. Statues stood along them, their features blurred by centuries underwater, but the proportions were strange, elongated, the faces caught in expressions that seemed less posed than interrupted. The crew fanned out cautiously. Some waded into the surf, others knelt to brush silt from carvings. One diver, an older man named Hughes, ducked below the surface and reappeared moments later, his mask dripping. "You need to see this," he said. "All of you." They followed him into the shallows, the water cool against their legs. Sunlight cut down through the waves, touching the shapes below with a shifting, golden light. And then Eleanor saw them. Statues, dozens of them, standing beneath the waves as if frozen mid-step. At first they seemed like the usual weathered guardians of some long-forgotten city, until her eyes adjusted and the familiarity struck her. These were not kings or gods or anonymous warriors. These were people she knew. There was Hughes himself, rendered in stone, his hand half raised in a gesture she had seen him make only that morning. There was McKenna, captured with his mouth open as though speaking, a bead of carved seawater clinging to his lip. And there, she almost stopped breathing, was herself, every detail correct, from the braid over her shoulder to the crease in her brow, her stone hand gripping the very compass she carried now. They were exact in a way no sculptor could achieve without study, but no one here had posed, and no one had been still long enough to be measured. These statues were of them now, yet they had not yet done the things the poses suggested. Hughes stared at his own likeness, the skin around his eyes tightening. "I've never stood like that in my life," he said. "Not yet," Eleanor murmured. The words seemed to carry into the water, rippling through the silence. More of the statues emerged as the tide fell further, not just the crew, but others. Faces Eleanor did not recognize, dressed in clothing from across centuries. A woman in the high collar of the Edwardian age, a sailor in the ragged tunic of a Roman oarsman, a boy with the close-cropped hair of a modern schoolchild. Some looked serene, others afraid, a few caught in the act of turning as though someone had called their name. A theory, sharp and unwanted, began to form in her mind. Perhaps these were not statues at all, not in the way the word was usually meant. Perhaps they were people, and the stone was not the medium but the consequence. The thought made her skin crawl, yet she could not stop herself from stepping closer to her own likeness. The eyes were carved in such detail that she could see the faint suggestion of reflection in their surface. The curve of the lips, the fall of the hair. It was her, down to the smallest flaw. The crew began to argue in low, urgent voices. Some wanted to retreat to camp. Others insisted they dive deeper, see how far the ruins extended. Rourke stood apart, scanning the horizon as though expecting something to rise from it. Eleanor knelt in the water, the compass warm in her palm. For reasons she could not name, she turned it toward her statue. The needle spun once, twice, then stopped, not pointing to the stone, but to the depths beyond it. She was still staring when it happened. A shift, small, almost imperceptible, in her statue's face. The faintest tremor in the carved eyelids, so slight she might have dismissed it as a trick of the light on water, until the left eye opened. It was not stone beneath the lid. It was an eye, wet, alive, and looking directly at her. The eye in the statue had followed her. Eleanor was certain of it. In the breathless moments after it blinked, she had stepped back into the shallows, half expecting the stone to crumble and reveal flesh beneath. But the statue remained as it had been, still and silent, its features fixed in the uncanny perfection of carved likeness. The others didn't believe her. They had seen only what the water allowed, a ripple, a trick of the light. But even those who dismissed her kept glancing toward the ruins, their movements sharp, restless. The air itself seemed different now, heavier, as though the island was holding its breath. By the next morning, the signs were no longer subtle. It began with Rourke's watch. He had worn the same battered marine chronometer for 15 years, and it had never failed him. But when he checked it over breakfast, the date it displayed made him go pale. January 14th, 2137, he read aloud, his voice flat. The crew laughed at first, a glitch, a dead battery. But one by one, they pulled out their own watches, phones, and navigation instruments. None agreed. McKenna's digital readout showed 1864. Hugh's wristwatch claimed it was April of 1592. Eleanor's GPS unit simply refused to give a date at all, only a blinking error. The realization crept over them like a slow tide. This was no mere fault in the devices. Time itself was fractured here. Eleanor tested the theory, checking her compass against the shifting shadows of the palms, measuring the sun's arc. The results made her stomach turn. Hours stretched and collapsed without logic. Sometimes the light seemed to fade toward evening, only to snap back to the brightness of midday. Other times, the shadows grew impossibly long in moments, as if a day had passed in the blink of an eye. She thought of the strange constellations overhead, of the frost that had come and gone overnight, of the centuries-spanning ruins beneath the waves. The truth was beginning to surface. The island was not just moving through space. It was dragging itself, and everything upon it, through time. And the pull was not gentle. That afternoon, she knelt at the edge of the water, staring down into the glassy surface. It was as still as a mirror, reflecting her face with unsettling clarity. But the longer she looked, the more the details shifted. Lines deepened around her eyes. Her skin darkened and weathered, as though burnt by years of sun. A streak of white appeared in her hair, and then another, until it was shot through with silver. She could not look away. Her reflection's eyes were her own, but older, far older, and filled with a weight she could not name. It was not just age in them, but knowledge, the kind that left scars deeper than any wound. She reached toward the water, her fingertips breaking its surface. The image wavered, but the reflection did not vanish. Instead, it leaned closer. Its lips moved. 3 words formed in silence, yet Eleanor felt them like a hand closing around her heart. "Don't trust them." She recoiled, the water shattering into ripples. Behind her, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of voices from somewhere inland, low, layered tones, speaking in the same unknown language she had heard whispered on the first nights. When she turned back to the water, her reflection had returned to its usual form. But she could not shake the sense that the older version of herself had not been a vision or a hallucination. It had been a warning, and it had come from a place she had not yet been. By the 10th day, the island had stopped pretending to be neutral ground. It was no longer simply a place we had landed. It had become a choice, a lure, a quiet whisper asking each of us to decide whether we wanted to leave at all. It began with small murmurs around the fires at night. A few crewmen, men who had once spoken only of getting home, began to wonder aloud if home was even worth returning to. Out there, the sea gave nothing but storms and salt. Out there, time pulled them toward the grave with the same steady hunger it gave to everyone. But here was different. They said it first as a joke. Maybe the frost on the palms isn't winter. Maybe it's the island keeping things fresh. But the way their eyes lingered on the untouched fruit, the perfect water, the unchanging weather, made it clear it wasn't really a joke. They spoke about the statues under the waves, not with fear, but with something like longing. Maybe that's not death. Maybe it's forever. It didn't take long for the idea to harden into belief. A faction formed. 6 of them, all quiet men until this voyage, now speaking with the conviction of the converted. They told the others the island was a sanctuary, that it could slip between centuries and carry them away from the decay of age. That if they stayed, they might live as long as the island did. Some listened. Some wanted to believe. Hunger and fear make even impossible promises sound like truth. But there was a cost. Supplies from the Archimedes were running low, and the island's bounty was not infinite. The perfect fruit began to rot overnight. The stream's water grew brackish in the mornings, clearing only by midday. Fish caught in the shallows sometimes had strange, translucent bones, brittle as glass. Paranoia set in like a damp chill. The faction began guarding the best fruit for themselves. They accused others of wasting water, of taking more than their share of the dwindling rations. Voices rose in the dark. Twice, Eleanor woke to hear the sound of someone running through the camp, boots pounding on sand, followed by silence too complete to be trusted. And then there were the shadows. It started at the edge of the jungle. Just after sunset, shapes moved between the trunks, tall, slow-moving, deliberate. At first, Eleanor thought they were members of the crew slipping away to relieve themselves. But when she called out, no one answered. When she checked the camp, everyone was accounted for. The shadows didn't always disappear when you looked straight at them. Sometimes they stood there, half hidden in the leaves, as if deciding whether to step forward. The wind in the fronds never matched the rhythm of their movements. Tensions climbed until every conversation felt like a test. Eleanor kept her head down, watching, listening. She was still thinking of the warning her older reflection had given her, don't trust them, though she could not yet decide who they were. The faction? The shadows? Or someone closer? It was late one night, while the camp slept, that she found the captain's log. Rourke kept it in his tent, bound in oilskin, tucked beneath his cot. Eleanor hadn't meant to search for it, but when she went to speak with him about the next day's watch, he wasn't there. The flap of the tent was half open, and the log lay in plain sight, as if waiting. She told herself she was only looking for notes on navigation, something to explain the island's patterns. But when she opened it, the truth bled out onto the page. Rourke had been here before. Not in those exact words, but the entries spoke of a shifting isle that appeared and vanished, a place of perfect provisions and unnatural silences. They were dated nearly 20 years earlier, on a voyage that had been officially listed as uneventful. And then she found the last entry from that earlier visit. It was short. "We cannot all leave. The island will not allow it. Chose the ones who could navigate. The rest remain." Her breath caught. She turned the page. There was nothing more. The log jumped ahead to the next recorded voyage, with no mention of what had happened to the crew he had left behind. She remembered Reed, the blind survivor. She remembered his words, "The island chooses who can leave." The pieces began to lock together, ugly and inevitable. Rourke hadn't simply stumbled into this expedition. He'd returned knowingly. He hadn't told them because he already understood the rules, and because he was willing to make the same choice again if it meant saving himself. She closed the log and stepped back into the night air. Across the camp, Rourke had returned. He stood at the edge of the firelight, speaking quietly with two of the men from the faction. Their faces were turned away, but their posture was too intent, too focused to be casual. Eleanor felt the warning echo through her again, hard and cold as a blade. Don't trust them. She didn't sleep. She lay in her tent, listening to the sound of the tide. Sometime past midnight, the earth shifted under her, a long, slow heave, as though the entire island had inhaled. The air grew heavy, the waves stilled. When she sat up, she saw that the stars were different. The constellations had changed. The island was moving again. She pushed out into the night. The camp was chaos. Tents sagged, their ropes pulled loose by the shift. People were shouting, searching. And Rourke was gone. His tent was empty. The captain's log lay on the sand, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Beyond the bay, the water gleamed with moonlight. In the distance, just before the fog swallowed the horizon, she thought she saw a small boat moving away, not drifting, but pulled like a piece of debris in a current too strong to fight. Then the fog closed in, and the sea was empty. The morning after Rourke vanished, the camp felt different, not only because of his absence, but because the island seemed watchful. The air was still, the tide sluggish, and even the birds, if there were birds here at all, had gone silent. The faction spoke in hushed voices, no longer pushing their immortality promises. Perhaps they were reconsidering. Perhaps they were waiting for something. Eleanor didn't join them. She left the camp early, taking only her pack, the compass, and enough water for a long walk. She had no destination in mind, only the need to move, to think without the heat of suspicion pressing against her skin. The island's interior was denser than she expected. The palms gave way to a forest of trees whose trunks twisted like rope, their leaves broad and waxy, dripping with a constant dew. The light here was strange, brighter than the shaded canopy should have allowed, as if it came from the ground instead of the sky. The air smelled faintly of salt even this far from shore, and underfoot, the soil was flecked with tiny shells and polished stones that whispered of ancient seas. Hours passed without her realizing it. The ground sloped upward, and the trees thinned, revealing a high ridge of exposed bedrock. From this height, she could see both sides of the island, the crescent bays mirroring each other like cupped hands. She was turning to leave when something caught her eye, a glint, not of metal, but of smooth stone, polished in deliberate lines. She approached, brushing away lichen and moss. What emerged beneath her fingertips made her still her breath. It was a map. Not a small one etched on a tablet or a slab. This covered the entire face of the bedrock, sprawling across it in lines as fine as the hair of a brush, carved deep enough to survive centuries. She stepped back to take it in, and the scale became clear. This was not a chart of one ocean, or even of the world as she knew it. It was bigger, stranger. The map was alive with movement. Or perhaps it only felt that way because her eyes kept catching patterns in its chaos. Thousands, no, tens of thousands, of tiny engraved shapes filled its surface, each one the outline of an island. Some were familiar, others not. They were scattered not only across the seas, but in places no water should have touched, inland, in deserts, among mountain ranges. The carving did not obey the geography she had learned. Thin lines connected them, curling and intersecting like strands of spun glass. Arrows pointed from one to another, looping back, crossing paths, spiraling outward. She traced one with her finger and realized it was a route, a journey. Not a single one, but thousands, all beginning and ending with the same crescent shape she now recognized without hesitation. The island on which she stood. This was its history. Every place it had been, every path it had taken through time and space. Not just oceans. Not just centuries. She followed one spiral inward, the lines tightening until they reached the center of the map. Here, the carving stopped. No more routes. No more islands. Just an empty circle, smooth and deep, as if the chisel had pressed harder here than anywhere else. At the very edge of the circle, there were markings unlike the others, not the flowing arrows of travel, but symbols she couldn't read. She took out her notebook and copied them carefully, her hand trembling without her permission. The emptiness of that circle felt final. Not a pause, but an ending. And then she saw it, the faint outline within the circle, barely visible unless the light hit it just so. It was the shape of the island. But instead of waves or currents surrounding it, there were rays. Not sunlight rays. Something sharper. The realization crawled over her skin, slow and cold. This was no resting place in the sea. The final destination carved into this map was in the sky. She thought of the constellations they'd seen that didn't belong to any hemisphere. Of the way the horizon sometimes blurred as if the sea ended too soon. Of the frost on the palms, the wrong seasons arriving overnight. This island wasn't bound to the ocean at all. The water was just one of the places it passed through. It was going somewhere above the world. Her mind spun through possibilities she didn't want to believe. An ancient ship that had forgotten it wasn't meant to fly, a fragment of Earth stolen by something that lived above the clouds, a piece of the planet that had been cut loose and learned to drift where it pleased. Whatever it was, the circle on the map meant it was headed for a place where no boat could follow. She stood there for a long time, staring at the smooth emptiness of that circle. It didn't feel like looking at a map. It felt like looking at a clock, one that was running out. The wind changed without warning. A low vibration trembled through the rock beneath her feet, subtle at first, then growing stronger. Pebbles danced in place, dust lifted into the air. The sound came next, not from the sky or the sea, but from deep below, a groaning that was almost a voice. The ridge tilted, just enough to make her stumble. She looked toward the horizon, and her stomach tightened. The waterline was dropping. Not in waves, in one great, steady withdrawal, as if the ocean itself were sinking away from the island. The tremor became a shake. Cracks spiderwebbed through the map beneath her boots, the engraved lines splitting but not breaking. She ran her fingers over the compass in her pocket, as if its steadiness could anchor her, but even it had begun to shiver, the needle quivering between directions. A shadow moved over her, but there were no clouds. The light dimmed, not from above, but from the way the air seemed to thicken, growing heavy, charged. Her ears popped as the pressure shifted. The ground lurched and she fell to her knees. The sound deepened into a roar. Somewhere in the distance, voices shouted, crew members calling her name, but their words were drowned in the rush of air, a wind not from the sea but from below, pushing upward through the cracks. The island was rising. The first stones fell into the sea like offerings, each one swallowed by the frothing water below. But then the rocks didn't fall anymore. They hovered. Pebbles rolled uphill, sand lifted from the beaches in shimmering veils, and the ocean itself began to peel away from the shore. The sound was not like a storm, nor like an earthquake. It was the groan of something impossibly old, breaking free from the chains that had kept it tethered for longer than anyone alive could imagine. The crew stood frozen at the shoreline, watching as the tide fled faster than their eyes could follow, leaving only glistening seabed and flailing fish in its wake. Ropes and barrels clattered across the ground, sliding toward the center of the island. Even the masts they had carved from the jungle's timber leaned inward, straining toward some invisible pull. The ground beneath them heaved, not a roll like the waves, but a deliberate, wrenching lift. One of the younger sailors screamed, pointing toward the horizon. The sea was falling away. No, not the sea. They were rising. It began slow enough to seem unreal. The beaches dropped from view, the smell of salt water fading, replaced by an unfamiliar chill. The jungle's canopy shifted as if caught in a breathless wind, leaves snapping shut, flowers folding in on themselves. Then came the rupture, a sound like the world's crust tearing open, and the island surged upward, faster than thought possible. The clouds, once a distant ceiling, rushed to meet them. Mist enveloped the crew, soaking their clothes in cold damp. Visibility dropped to nothing but white, until, without warning, the fog broke, and they saw the sky from above. They had pierced the cloud cover into a world no chart had ever recorded. The air was crystalline, sharp with a purity no sailor could ever taste at sea level. And spread before them was an archipelago like none on Earth. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of islands floated in the blue expanse, each drifting on unseen currents. Some were small as skiffs, others as vast as nations, their cliffs veiled in waterfalls that vanished into the clouds below. Rivers wound across them like silver threads, feeding lakes that mirrored the sun. In the distance, the peaks of mountains jutted from these airborne lands, capped with snow that never touched the ocean. The crew whispered prayers, curses, and silent awe. A few laughed, not from joy, but from the fragile madness that comes when the world turns upside down. Eleanor stood apart, her gaze fixed not on the horizon but on the compass in her palm. Since their ascent, the needle had been spinning wildly, but now it slowed, trembling before coming to rest. It didn't point toward any one island or direction. Instead, it tilted as though weighing two forces, and the message she felt in her bones was not one of location but of decision. Fit or leave. The meaning came not from logic, but from the strange, bone-deep certainty that had guided her since finding the captain's log. Staying meant surrendering to this place, to its laws, its beauty, and perhaps its immortality. But the cost would be everything else. The world below, the lives they'd once known, the stories they'd meant to return to. Leaving meant falling, perhaps back to the ocean, perhaps to nothing at all. The others had seen the choice too, though they might not have put it into words. A murmur ran through the crew. Some looked to the Sky Islands as if they'd already claimed them as home. Others turned toward the now distant clouds below, longing for the certainty of saltwater and tides, even if it meant death in the attempt to find land again. The island itself seemed to be listening. The ground pulsed faintly beneath their feet, a slow heartbeat, as though it waited for their answer. Eleanor closed her eyes. She saw the map carved into the bedrock, its endless routes, its final empty circle. She remembered Rourke's disappearance, the betrayal, the shifting shores, the seasons that changed overnight. All of it had led here. When she opened her eyes, the sky seemed impossibly wide. She knew her choice. She took 3 steps back from the cliff's edge, then ran. Her boots pounded against the moss and stone, each stride a defiance of the invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. The air rushed past her as she leapt. For an instant, she was weightless, suspended between the island above and the clouds below. Then gravity found her. She plunged into the mist, the world dissolving into cold and wind. The roar of air filled her ears, and the clouds swallowed her whole. She expected the sea, its slap against her body, the crushing embrace of its depths. But when she broke through the last of the fog, there was no ocean to catch her. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. The surface was not water but sand, hot, dry, and unyielding. She rolled onto her back, coughing, the sun burning her eyes. When she managed to sit up, the truth unfolded around her. There was no ocean, no sky islands above, only a vast, endless desert stretching to every horizon, its dunes rippling like the frozen waves of some vanished sea. The air shimmered with heat, though she could feel no wind. She turned in every direction, searching for the shadow of the island, for a dark shape against the blinding sun. But the sky was empty. The island was gone. She was alone. In the silence, a memory rose, not of the sea, but of the carved map's final circle. Empty, smooth, waiting. She realized with a slow, sick certainty that she had not escaped the island. She had simply followed it into another of its places, another of its guises. And if the map was to be believed, this was only the beginning. The sand shifted beneath her hand, revealing a fragment of stone, weathered but carved. She brushed it clean. The pattern was the same as the bedrock map, but smaller, rougher, as if chipped from its edge. Her heartbeat quickened. She knew now that the island didn't just move. It shed pieces of itself, scattering them across every realm it touched, leaving trails for those desperate or foolish enough to follow. And she had followed, straight into a place that might not even be part of the same world she had left. The horizon seemed to bend. A shimmer of heat blurred the line between sand and sky, and for an instant she thought she saw something there. The outline of a ship, sails full, drifting not on water but through the air above the dunes. Then the vision broke, leaving only the sun. Her throat was dry, her canteen long empty. She pressed the stone fragment to her chest, the only proof she had that the island had ever been real. Somewhere, far beyond sight, she knew it still moved, through skies, through deserts, through oceans and mountains and places no map dared name. And perhaps, if she kept walking, she might find it again. But whether it would welcome her, or take her forever, she could not know. She stood, the sand swallowing her footprints as she began to walk toward the distant shimmer. Behind her, the desert was empty. Above her, the sky was bare. And ahead, the heat warped the air into shapes she could not trust. The island was gone, but its story was not finished. And so the wind carries her footprints away, just as it has erased the traces of every soul who dared follow the island's shifting path. Perhaps it drifts still, above clouds or beneath seas, hiding in deserts no map remembers. Perhaps its stones lie under your own feet, waiting to wake. The question is not whether the island exists, but whether you will see it when it calls. If this journey has left you wondering, if it has set something in your chest stirring like the tide under moonlight, then you already know there are more stories, more forgotten maps, more lost civilizations, more whispers of places that may yet rise before your eyes. Walk with us into those shadows. Stand with us at those shorelines where history meets the impossible. Like this tale, share it with those who still believe in wonders, and leave your thoughts below, for every question and theory brings us closer to the truth. And if you wish to never miss the moment when the next horizon appears, then remain with us, subscribe, and keep your eyes open. The next door may already be waiting.